Ben Shapiro didn't wait for Gavin Newsom to finish polishing the California miracle speech because he knew the shine was the point. He cut in with that cost-adjusted poverty number like he'd pulled a thread on a designer suit, and suddenly everyone in the room was staring at the seam. 23.5% is the kind of figure that doesn't need a follow-up punchline, because it already sounds like one. If you're running what you describe as the future of America, why does it look like nearly 1 in 4 Californians are stuck underwater when you adjust for the price tag of living there? That wasn't an accusation of malice. It was a question about results, and it landed hard because it forced the success story to answer for the people who don't feel successful. Ben Shapiro delivered it with that fast, clipped certainty he's built an empire on. But it wasn't the speed that mattered. It was the specificity. You can argue values all night, but a statistic with a source feels like it's bolted to the floor. Gavin Newsom tried to pivot like a seasoned professional, dragging it toward personality, toward motives, toward "you left" because that's safer ground. But Shapiro's response wasn't really personal. It was economic, and that distinction matters when you're trying to look like a national leader. He framed himself as a guy who had the income, the platform, and the options, and still couldn't justify the math of staying. The audience felt the shift immediately, because opening statements are supposed to be smooth runway, not a sudden crosswind. Fox News had built a debate hall that looked formal enough to pretend this was policy theater. But the vibe turned into cross-examination in under a minute. Brett Baer looked like he wanted to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but you could tell the tube was already crumpled. Newsom's smile flickered, and that flicker became the first viral clip, because modern politics reads body language like it's gospel. It wasn't that he lost right then, it was that he got pulled into a game where charm alone doesn't pay the entry fee. Shapiro kept returning to the same theme, not "you're evil," but "explain the contradiction." He cited the U.S. Census Bureau and the supplemental poverty measure like they were witnesses who couldn't be intimidated. Newsom argued that high costs come with desirability, which is true as far as it goes, but the debate wasn't about whether California is beautiful. It was about whether a state can call itself a model while the model's middle class keeps packing boxes. And the second Shapiro brought up population loss, the "everyone wants to live here" line started sounding less like confidence and more like muscle memory. Newsom tried to explain migration as pandemic turbulence, remote work reshuffling, the usual set of big national forces. Shapiro framed it as a trend that began earlier, then intensified, which is the kind of claim that doesn't need certainty to be effective, only plausibility. He didn't say every person leaving is fleeing failure. He implied the net number suggests something is pushing people out. That's a subtle move. It avoids declaring motives while still inviting the audience to infer them. And audiences love inference because it feels like they're doing the thinking themselves. The debate's structure was supposed to protect the governor, with orderly segments and measured timing. Shapiro's whole strategy was to break the rhythm, because rhythm is where politicians hide. If Newsom could glide from innovation to climate, to rights, to the future, he could make the record feel like a mood board. Shapiro wanted it to feel like an audit, with line items that don't care how photogenic your hair looks under studio lights. It's hard to sell a dream when someone keeps asking for the receipt. Homelessness was the first real test of that audit style, because it's the issue even Californians who love California can't explain away with sunsets. Shapiro didn't call anyone a criminal, but he kept using phrases like, "Where did it go?" which is political dynamite because it implies someone benefited. He talked about billions spent and outcomes getting worse, and you could see Newsom's team's nightmare forming in real time. Not because Newsom had no response, but because any response that sounds complicated can be framed as excuse-making. When people see tents and encampments, they don't want a flowchart. They want a clear sense that somebody is in charge. Newsom went to the standard triad: housing costs, mental health, substance abuse, because those are real drivers and they're familiar to voters. Shapiro didn't deny any of that. He just kept the target on governance. If those are the drivers, why are the policies producing such expensive, slow, uneven solutions? He cited per-unit costs and consultant fees and study the crisis bureaucracy, and whether every figure was perfectly contextualized almost didn't matter. The emotional point was that the state looks rich, but its public systems can look strangely incompetent at basic human problems. That's a brutal contrast to defend on live television, especially when your brand is competence with progressive values. Then Shapiro went where debates get truly dangerous: hypocrisy, not as a moral condemnation, but as a pattern that suggests leaders don't live under their own rules. The French Laundry story is powerful, not because it proves corruption, but because it's visually simple. A lockdown era, an elite restaurant, a bill that looks like a mortgage payment, and the ordinary person being told to cancel Thanksgiving plans. Even if you apologized, the image stays, because it's not about forgiveness, it's about trust. Once the audience believes you're asking them to sacrifice while you treat the rules like suggestions, every policy argument gets filtered through that resentment. The private school angle hit the same nerve, because it's the quiet American suspicion that the system is always good enough for other people's kids. Shapiro framed it as a question of fairness. If public schools are thriving, why not use them personally? Newsom tried to draw a boundary around family decisions, which is reasonable in ordinary life, but politics doesn't respect ordinary boundaries. In politics, the personal becomes proof of what you really believe, especially when your opponents frame it that way. A private decision can still look like a public confession that you don't fully trust what you're selling. Shapiro's tactic wasn't to prove any single scandal. It was to stack a series of uncomfortable optics until the audience felt a pattern. That's how modern persuasion works. Less courtroom, more montage. You see lockdowns, elite dinner, private school, high costs, people leaving, and the brain forms a storyline before the conscious mind catches up. Newsom kept trying to return to values and vision, but Shapiro kept anchoring the conversation to what people can film on their phones. Vision is abstract, but a locked deodorant case in a pharmacy is very, very concrete. When the debate moved to crime, it wasn't about whether crime exists in every state. It was about whether California's approach feels out of step with common sense. Shapiro pointed to Proposition 47 as shorthand for a policy era, the way people use a single law to summarize an entire attitude. Newsom emphasized that voters passed it, which is true, but the political question isn't authorship, it's leadership. If the public thinks a policy is backfiring, they look to the governor to change the climate around it, not just recite procedure. And once Shapiro played the retail theft clips, the debate got emotionally lopsided, because the visuals do the arguing for you. You can debate data definitions, reported crime versus actual crime, enforcement changes, prosecutorial discretion, until everyone's eyes glaze over. But you can't unsee a crowd walking out of a store with trash bags of merchandise while staff stand there like they're waiting for a bus. Shapiro didn't say legalized theft. He implied it's functionally tolerated, which is a safer rhetorical lane and still lands like a hammer. Newsom could have tried to unpack the nuance, but nuance is slow, and Shapiro was driving fast. In that moment, the governor wasn't debating policy. He was debating the audience's sense that the social contract is fraying. The population segment became the bridge between personal anecdotes and statewide trends. Shapiro's U-Haul price example was clever because it sounded like market truth, instead of partisan opinion. Maybe it's not a perfect proxy, maybe it's just one data point, but it's the kind of street-level metric audiences trust because it feels apolitical. He used it to suggest directionality, more demand to leave than to arrive. And that suggestion doesn't require a grand conspiracy to be persuasive. It just requires people to nod and say, "Yeah, that sounds about right." Newsom tried to argue that California's desirability drives costs, which again is not crazy, but Shapiro pushed the follow-up. Desirability for whom? If the winners are the wealthy and the strivers with tech salaries, what happens to the nurse, the teacher, the firefighter, the young family? That's not a left versus right question. It's a stability question, because the middle class is the glue that keeps a state functional. Shapiro framed the exodus as a middle-class flight, and Newsom had to fight that frame without sounding dismissive of people who feel squeezed. It's hard to say we're succeeding when voters hear you can't afford to live where you work. Business flight came next, and this is where things got trickier, because companies move for many reasons. Shapiro listed relocations like they were verdicts, and even if each case is more complicated than a soundbite, the accumulation creates the impression of trend. He named Tesla and Oracle as symbols, not just firms, because symbols carry emotional weight. To an audience already primed to believe California overregulates, a corporate relocation sounds like the private sector voting with its feet. Newsom could argue California still houses enormous economic power, but Shapiro's point wasn't California is dead, it was California is leaking. The education segment was where the debate risked feeling mean, because it brushes against real families and children. Shapiro tried to keep it about options and outcomes rather than shaming anyone, which is the only way to make that attack land without looking cruel. He invoked national rankings and standardized performance, then contrasted them with elite choices, implying a two-tier system. Newsom tried to separate family life from policy, and many viewers will sympathize with that, but Shapiro's message was simple. Leadership is credibility. If you don't behave like you trust your own system, why should anyone else? Then came high-speed rail, the California project that has become a national punchline, because it's the perfect metaphor for big promises and slow delivery. Shapiro framed it as a timeline mismatch, what voters were told versus what voters have today, which is a safe critique because it's about expectations. Newsom argued complexity, land acquisition, environmental review, the long list of hurdles that are real in California governance. Shapiro reframed those hurdles as self-imposed, the result of choices and interest groups and process layers, which again is a claim that doesn't need to prove corruption to spark suspicion. He didn't have to say, "someone stole," he just had to make viewers wonder why a project can absorb billions and still feel intangible. By the time the debate reached its final stretch, the theme wasn't "Shapiro is right about everything," it was "Newsom can't escape the frame." Every time Newsom tried to lift the conversation into national moral language, climate, rights, inclusion, Shapiro pulled it back down to cost of living and outcomes. That's not because those values don't matter, but because voters often treat values as luxury items when their rent is eating their paycheck. Newsom tried to cast Shapiro as a critic on the sidelines, but Shapiro cast Newsom as a manager failing a basic performance review. And in politics, the manager frame is lethal because it makes voters ask, "If you can't run this, why should we promote you?" In the closing, Newsom went full aspirational, because that's what governors do when they want to sound presidential. He talked about California as the future, and it's not hard to understand why he believes that, because the state is culturally influential and economically massive. But Shapiro's closing was the reverse. not a denial of California's greatness, but a claim that greatness is being squandered by governance that can't match its rhetoric. He didn't need to prove every number down to the decimal to make the emotional case that the governor looked cornered. And the crowd reaction, mixed as it was, signaled the real winner wasn't a person. It was the clip economy. Once the debate ended, the internet didn't care about the most nuanced exchanges. It cared about the cleanest moments. Shapiro's opening interruption. The poverty number. The why are people leaving loop. The private school contrast. The high-speed rail, how many operational miles question. None of those moments, on their own, establishes a definitive narrative about governance, but they create a feeling. And feelings drive politics. Newsom's team would naturally try to stabilize the message afterward, but stabilization is hard when the audience has already chosen the highlights. Every follow-up interview becomes a trap, because if you elaborate, you sound defensive, and if you refuse, you sound evasive. The governor can say, "It's complicated," but the clips have already taught viewers that complicated can sound like, "I can't answer." And Shapiro's supporters can declare victory even without proving a thesis, because the governor looked like he was constantly trying to escape. The real damage, if there is damage, isn't that a debate ended anyone's career on the spot. Politics rarely works that cleanly. The damage is that it gives opponents a reusable script. Cost-adjusted poverty, homelessness spending, migration, hypocrisy optics, stalled megaprojects. Once a script sticks, it becomes a default lens through which every future appearance is interpreted. Newsom can give a speech about climate, and half the audience will be thinking about home prices. He can talk about rights, and someone will reply with a homelessness statistic. It also elevated Shapiro because it gave him the kind of mainstream confrontation he thrives on. A polished official versus a data-heavy challenger. That doesn't mean he proved everything he implied. It means he controlled the vibe, and controlling the vibe is half the battle. He looked prepared in a prosecutorial way, and Newsom looked like he expected a conversation and got a deposition. That's the entire arc in one sentence, and that's why it spread. The more it spread, the more it became self-fulfilling, because people watched expecting a takedown and interpreted each exchange through that expectation. The next phase of the story wasn't the spin, it was the aftertaste, because debates like this don't end when the cameras cut. They end when the audience decides what they just saw. Newsom's camp would naturally insist the whole thing was a set piece built for clips, and they wouldn't be wrong about the format. Shapiro's camp would naturally insist it was accountability finally breaking through a media bubble, and they wouldn't be wrong about the appetite. But the deeper point is that both sides were selling something, and the public was shopping with skepticism. When voters feel squeezed, they don't buy "trust me," they buy "show me," and Shapiro structured the night around that instinct. The first 24 hours became a contest over framing rather than facts, because facts are slow and framing is instant. Newsom's allies highlighted California's GDP size, job creation, venture capital, clean energy investment, and cultural influence, essentially saying, "Look at the scoreboard." Shapiro's allies highlighted cost-adjusted poverty, housing prices, homelessness outcomes, and migration, saying, "Look at who can't afford to play." It's the same state, two scoreboards, and a country that can't decide whether success is measured by totals or by the median family. And that tension is exactly why the clip economy loved this debate, because it's a perfect Rorschach test for what you think government is supposed to do. Newsom's problem wasn't that he lacked material, it was that his best material required context, and context doesn't trend. Saying "this is complicated" might be true, but it sounds like ducking when your opponent is waving a number like a badge. Saying we're investing long-term might be true, but it sounds like delay when viewers can point to tents, grid warnings, and rent that eats the paycheck. Saying we lead in innovation might be true, but it sounds like bragging when someone counters with, then why are the basics breaking? The harsh reality is that leadership gets judged on what's visible, and California's most visible problems are very visible. Shapiro's advantage was simplicity, and simplicity is underrated as a political weapon. He didn't have to prove a grand theory about progressive governance. He only had to make viewers feel like the governor was evading plain questions. Every time Newsom climbed into big themes, Shapiro yanked him back down to a bill, a price tag, a rank, a timeline, or a how many. That method has a built-in trap. If Newsom tries to answer every detail, he looks bogged down. If he refuses, he looks slippery. And once the audience believes you're slippery, even your truthful statements start to sound rehearsed. The homelessness exchange kept resurfacing because it's the easiest one to visualize, even for people who have never set foot in California. Numbers like billions spent and worse outcomes don't automatically prove waste. But they do invite the most basic question taxpayers ask. What exactly changed? And why doesn't it show up in the streets the way it shows up on budgets? When Shapiro talked about per-unit costs, the smarter viewers asked for nuance, but the angrier viewers didn't care, because anger doesn't request footnotes. The governor's best defense, structural costs, land constraints, service requirements, was also his weakest defense on camera, because it sounded like bureaucracy speaking for itself. Housing was the silent main character behind everything, even when they weren't talking about it directly. Cost-adjusted poverty is basically a housing story with different math, and migration is a housing story with a moving truck. Homelessness is the cruelest housing story, because it's what happens when the floor drops out entirely. Even crime anxiety becomes a housing story when people feel like the deal is broken. High prices, high taxes, and still a sense of disorder. Newsom could have tried to flood the zone with housing permits, construction starts, new bills, and projections, but Shapiro had already framed the question as, why is it still this bad? Then came the hypocrisy optics, which are always more dangerous than policy disputes because they feel personal to the audience. If a voter believes leaders live by different rules, policy arguments start sounding like lectures from someone who won't take their own advice. Newsom can insist family choices are private, and most reasonable people agree in normal life. But debates aren't normal life. Debates are symbolic combat. And symbolism is why the private school line sticks even when it's unfairly reductive. The audience doesn't hear education policy, they hear different class. And once that clicks, it's hard to unclick. The high-speed rail segment landed for a similar reason. It's the poster child for big promises that feel stuck in permanent construction mode. You don't have to hate California to roll your eyes at a megaproject with shifting timelines and expanding budgets. Shapiro didn't have to say anyone intended failure, he just had to make 0 operational miles sound like a punchline. Newsom could counter with, progress isn't always linear, but that still sounds like asking people to applaud a blueprint. When voters are paying today's prices, they don't want a future ribbon cutting, they want proof that the machine can deliver anything on schedule. What made the debate feel big to national audiences is that California isn't just a state, it's an idea Americans argue about. To some, it's the engine of the future. Tech, entertainment, research, diversity, climate ambition, cultural gravity. To others, it's a warning. Expensive living, slow governance, regulatory overload, a widening gap between winners and everyone else. Newsom and Shapiro weren't just debating a record. They were debating which California is real, the brochure California or the daily life California. And because both versions exist, neither side could fully bury the other without looking like they were lying by omission. If Newsom wanted to retake control, he needed to do something that feels almost illegal in modern politics: concede a problem in plain language. Not the soft concession, "we have challenges," but the sharper one, "this is unacceptable and here's what I'm changing, specifically." Audiences are surprisingly forgiving when they believe you're being candid, but they are merciless when they believe you're performing. Shapiro's whole persona is built around punishing performance, so the worst move against him is to sound like a politician. The best move is to sound like a manager who is tired of excuses and is about to break something and rebuild it. But that's also risky, because conceding too much becomes another clip, and Shapiro would happily use it as a trophy. So Newsom is caught between honesty and ammunition, which is the same trap most leaders face in the viral era. And Shapiro is caught between critique and credibility, because the more he looks like he's prosecuting, the more viewers ask what he'd actually do differently. It's easy to ask why, harder to propose a fix that doesn't create new problems, especially in a state as large and complex as California. That's why the debate's energy tilted toward indictment rather than solutions, because indictments are cleaner than blueprints. The fallout clips would keep looping, but the real long-term consequence is subtler. It changes what people expect to hear from Newsom next. After a night like that, a speech about national values has to fight through a mental pop-up ad that says, "Answer the housing question." Every time Newsom talks about the future, some viewers will think about the middle-class math Shapiro kept hammering. Every time he talks about compassion, some viewers will think about spending totals and visible street conditions. That doesn't make Newsom wrong. It just means the debate rewired the audience's default associations. And that, more than wins and losses, is the real power of a confrontation like this. A single night can't rewrite a state's reality, but it can rewrite the story people tell themselves about that reality. If Shapiro succeeded, it wasn't because he proved every insinuation. It's because he made unanswered questions feel mainstream and discussable. If Newsom struggled, it wasn't because he had nothing to say. It's because what he needed to say took longer than the format allowed. In the end, the state didn't change overnight, but the lens did. And once a lens changes, everything that follows looks different. Hat lingered after all the analysis, and reaction wasn't a clear verdict, but a kind of low-grade unease that settled into the conversation about leadership itself. The debate didn't convince everyone of anything, but it convinced a lot of people that the usual scripts no longer work the way they used to. For years, politicians could rely on broad narratives to carry them through uncomfortable moments, trusting that ideology would shield them from granular scrutiny. That night suggested something different. Voters are less interested in whether a story sounds inspiring and more interested in whether it survives basic arithmetic. Not because they've become cynical, but because daily life has become too expensive to ignore numbers that describe it. Newsom's challenge now isn't ideological, it's perceptual. He can keep making the case for California as a moral and cultural leader, and there's plenty of evidence to support that view. But he also has to operate in a media climate where every policy speech is filtered through a spreadsheet someone else controls. When Shapiro says, "Show me the results," he's tapping into a broader mood that isn't partisan so much as transactional. People want to know what they're getting for what they're paying, and that instinct doesn't care about party labels. Shapiro, on the other hand, faces a different long-term test. It's one thing to critique from the outside, another to offer a coherent alternative that survives the same level of scrutiny. Relentless questioning is powerful, but eventually, audiences start asking what comes after the questions. If California's model is flawed, what replaces it that doesn't sacrifice the same values Newsom talks about? Accountability without a roadmap can feel satisfying in the moment, but empty in the long run. The debate also revealed something uncomfortable about political communication itself. We've reached a point where the most persuasive argument isn't always the most accurate one, but the one that feels easiest to visualize. A single receipt, a single clip, a single chart can outweigh years of policy nuance, simply because it fits in a phone screen. This doesn't mean facts no longer matter. It means the way facts are framed matters more than ever. And the people who master that framing don't need to be right about everything to shape how everything is seen. In that sense, the real lesson wasn't about California or conservatism or progressivism. It was about the shrinking space for complexity in a culture that consumes politics like entertainment. Newsom tried to speak in paragraphs. Shapiro answered in bullet points. And bullet points are easier to remember. The audience didn't walk away with a policy plan. They walked away with a mental highlight reel. And highlight reels don't ask for context. They ask for reaction. So the story continues, not as a resolved argument, but as a reframed one. California remains powerful, innovative, contradictory, admired, and criticized at the same time. Newsom remains a skilled communicator with real accomplishments and real vulnerabilities. Shapiro remains a sharp critic whose strength lies in exposing gaps rather than filling them. And the voters remain where they always are, somewhere between wanting hope and wanting proof. What the debate ultimately showed is that modern political survival depends less on being perfect and more on being explainable. Not flawless, but legible. Not inspirational, but defensible. In a world where everyone has access to data, but no one has patience for nuance, the leaders who last are the ones who can translate complexity into something that doesn't feel like evasion. Whether Newsom adapts to that reality and whether Shapiro ever steps into the responsibility side of the equation is a story that will unfold long after the clips stop trending.